Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I would be happy to come anytime that I'm invited. So thank you for holding these values. I want to talk a little bit about my personal journey, some of the work we've done, and maybe some design principles, 4 design principles that you can take with you. But if I were to reflect on my journey, I have tried to be the change in all kinds of different ways. And as I have tried to be the change, I've realized that actually more than changing the world, I'm changing myself. For so many decades, I've seen suffering in the world and I've wanted to do something about it. And I tried 18 hours a day, every day. I worked very hard. But I realized that actually trying to change myself is much harder. Changing the world is very hard, but trying to change myself is even harder. But I realized that the good thing about this is that it's a very symbiotic relationship, that the more I try to give on the outside, the more I change myself and the more I can give. And it's a very regenerative cycle. So I want to share a little bit about this idea of being the change. Change is the being. One of my friends was teaching a class, and in this class he asked everybody, where did you learn how to be good? And so everyone raises their hands and shares these stories. And this one fellow raises his hand and he says, I learned how to be good from my 5-year-old son. Many years ago, it was Christmas Eve, so December 24th night. I'd given my gifts to my son, and he was very excited. At midnight, he opened his gifts. The next morning, he's had exactly just a few hours to play with his toys. The next morning, one of the kids from the neighborhood slums comes to his doorstep. And so the dad looks at him and says, son, why don't you share one of your toys? You got so many yesterday. Why don't you share one of your toys? And the son says, no way, Dad. I just got this last night. I'm not sharing this. No way. Dad looks at him and says, son, why don't you share one of your toys? And so, I don't know if you've seen the movie Lion King, right? This is the Mufasa-Simba moment, where Mufasa is kind, but also stern, looking at him, and the son doesn't really want to do it. Finally, he goes out and decides to give one of his toys. Now, of course, he's a smart, he's one of these enterprising kids, someone like me perhaps, who says, oh, if I have to give one of my toys, why don't I give my least favorite toy? So he picks his least favorite toy. The dad sees that and says, no, son, why don't you give him your favorite toy? And at this point, the son's just crying. And he's like, no, Dad, I cannot let go. I just got this yesterday. I'm not gonna. And Dad, again, Mufasa, standing there saying, you cry all you want. Well, I want you to practice generosity. So the son goes out, and he's about to go give away his favorite toy. And before he comes back, the dad is thinking, maybe I should appreciate him. Maybe I should, think about buying him another toy that's just like that. He has all these schemes in his mind to encourage his son. But lo and behold, his son comes back with a huge smile on his face. He looks his dad in the eye. Before the dad can even say anything, he looks his dad in the eye and says, Dad, that was amazing. Can I do it again? And anyone who has tried generosity will tell you that it is absolutely amazing. And you invariably, not because a teacher told you, not because you're going to get an award, not because you're going to have material gains, but because there is an inner transformation that happens. The theme of this conference is transformation. There is outer transformation, but there's also a deep place for inner transformation. And it happens when the time ripens, but it's a force to be reckoned with. And if you look at the Gandhis and the Dalai Lamas and the Mother Teresas of the world, they based their world-changing movements on this idea that if I change, the world will change. And if I don't change and I try to change the world on the outside, there's something hollow about that. So this has been my journey. I mean, let's see, I have to turn it on first. I'll skip through some of my slides. This is like me back in the days when I used to have hair. And, I was just doing my own thing, right? This is the college days. Then I said, I want to go out and try to help other people, try to change the world. I did a lot of that. And then ultimately, I put this photo up. You can't see it too well. I also had hair back then, but it's hidden. But this is one of the weakest moments of my life, when my wife and I decided to go on a walking pilgrimage many years after we had started ServiceSpace. We went on a walking pilgrimage, and we said, we're going to go to the Gandhi ashram in India, because Gandhi was an inspiration, and we're going to walk south. So we're going to eat whatever food is offered, sleep wherever place is offered. If you think kindness is so cool, let's see how you do it. It would be like me telling you, give me all your wallets, give me all your cell phones, and I'm going to drop you into some random place, and I'll see you in a year. They're like, how am I going to survive? How does that work? It turns out that we didn't have a 5-year plan even when we were in our mother's wombs, right? And we did okay. But we didn't have that 5-year plan, and we did okay because we were connected. And generosity connects us. And if you don't have that process if you don't have the inner capacities to be kind and generous in every moment, you are going to starve. You are not going to have a place to sleep. So have fun. Right? Can you be kind or have fun starving? So on this walk, it was paradigm bending. There are many stories that changed us. There was one in particular that I still remember. And it was an area where it was very hard to get water. And of course, this is like 42 degrees heat, right? Like on many days, very hot, hottest part of the summer, we somehow ended up walking. And we just had a backpack full of our basic stuff. And so we were walking, and we didn't have water in this area, and we were wondering how we're going to get water. This grandmother looks at us, and she says, you guys must be thirsty. Do you want water? We said, yes, that would be great. And so we go. She gives us water. In a broken pot, she had a little bit of water. She gives it all to us. Later, we found out it took her 4 hours to go and get that much water. And she was just kind and generous to us. Then she looks at us and says, you guys look hungry. Do you want some food? And I was like, I shouldn't ask, but yes. She goes and brings me some food, me and my wife. And the grandpa, while this is happening, is looking at both of us, and he's not paying any attention. But right as we're about to leave, he looks at me in the eye, and he's like, son, what are you doing? I said, Grandpa, we're trying to change ourselves. We do small acts of kindness. We try to build relationships with other people that are selfless, and we share stories to spread the word about good things, and ultimately, we're trying to change our hearts, the patterns of our hearts. He looked at us, he's like, okay, yeah, where did you start from? So there's a city called Ahmedabad. That's where we had started from, where the Gandhi ashram is. I said, we started from Ahmedabad. So he looks at us, and he says, oh, Mehmedabad, because there's another city with an M in front of it. And so I said, maybe Grandpa's a little hard of hearing. I said, no, Grandpa, Mehmedabad, Ahmedabad, not Mehmedabad. So he says, yeah, that's what I said, Mehmedabad. So I was like, I really yelled it out the third time, right? I was like, okay, it's Ahmedabad, 127 kilometers from here. And he looked at me, and he said, oh, so I see you're not on a pilgrimage after all. And I said, what do you mean? He says, you're still keeping track of the number of kilometers. And even I was thinking, oh my God, like how did I not round up 130 or 125, right? How did I know 127? I'd left it all. I had nothing. And I was still keeping track. Didn't have a computer with an Excel spreadsheet, but that was in my head because I'm still trying to do number of kilometers. I don't know. I wasn't even aware of it. And so I realized that ultimately, for me, that there's a way to give that is sympathy-oriented, right? That I have, you don't have, let me give to you. If you've ever received in that way, it doesn't feel good. Even if you're given in that way, you would realize it's actually a very low bandwidth way of giving. Farther along the way, from sympathy, you have a deeper experience of generosity, which is empathy. It's not just that I see your pain, I feel your pain. But man, if you're going to feel the pain of every single person on the planet, that's going to weigh you down. So you realize, what I realized was that there was a third category, which was not sympathy or empathy, but compassion. And the way in which compassion is different is that it knows how to distinguish between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable. I had a lot of pain. I was sitting on the chair behind him, and our dean sat on that chair. My leg was under there. I had a lot of pain. But suffering is optional. He's nodding his head. Suffering is optional. Right? Pain will come and go, but there's a lot of drama before and after. Right? And we can hold each other in those moments of suffering, and compassion allows us to do that. Now, if you ask most people what's the difference between this, I can tell you all, you can all do acts of kindness. And I say, okay, what percentage of that act of kindness was sympathy? What percentage was empathy? What percentage was compassion? Most of us have not done any inner work to even distinguish. And that is why, is it any surprise that when you have billions of dollars and you say, well, I want to uplift a continent like Africa, what have we done in 30 years? Nothing. We've actually had it go down because the sympathy model just doesn't work. Even Maslow himself said, oh, my Maslow's hierarchy of needs. No, it's actually more like vitamins. You know, you don't finish all your course of vitamin C and then you finally get to vitamin E, right? Like you need them all in balance. So it's not that, oh, yeah, you may have material lack, but doesn't mean you can't do acts of kindness. You can't do acts of generosity, right? This inner transformation is not a luxury sport. That, oh, I have to be higher up on that triangle, only then it's available to me. Man, I have met so many people who have nothing. I have had food from the homes of people where they go and borrow food to feed me. And when you say that, and when you say, wow, well, who do I want to be like? When I grow up, I'm like, I want to have a heart like that guy. I've met countless people like that. So this spirit of compassion, I think the organizing question for me becomes, how can we design for compassion? Not sympathy or empathy, but this deep, profound compassion. And we need that in our world today. This is Hans Eichelboom. He's a photographer. He stands outside in public places, usually outside of stores, in downtown areas, and he just takes photos in 2 hours. And he notices, oh my God, all these people think they're all being individuals, but they all kind of look the same. Right? This is in Netherlands again. They all are kind of looking the same, just in a 2-hour span. And he just goes again, and again, and again, and in different places, in China, around the world. And, okay, New York, let's see what they do. All right, let's see what they do on a hot day without any clothes on. They're still looking the same. What you see is that we have this illusion of progress and individual sort of freedom, but what we're really designing for is a monoculture, this sort of sameness. And that's creating a lot of problems. If all my fingers were the same, wouldn't quite have the utility of a hand that I do. Right? So how do we start to change that? You know, if you look at languages, 90% of the languages are going to be gone that we knew as humanity are going to be gone this century. We're losing language, like, you know, actually, even if I'm from India, we have this root language is Sanskrit. My mom has a master's in Sanskrit. She always tells me, Nipun, in English, you just use the word love. We have 108 words for love. Like, there are different kinds of love. So when you start to monoculturize everything, there's a lot of different consequences. We look at modern-day music. It's not just the history. You look at modern-day music, we tend to think, wow, you know, so many amazing new songs. Actually, a shocking percentage of the top 40 songs are written by the same 4 Scandinavian men. And you look at that, okay, well, all right, okay, well, what about the future? What's coming up? I was recently invited to a conference on, like, futures, you know, thinking on this dialogue. And the person hosting the dialogue had posted an article which led with this photo, and it was titled, The Future of Parenting. I don't know if you can see that. But see, what they're saying, I'll explain it to you. They're saying, well, we have our Fitbits, right? And we're measuring our heartbeats and whatnot. Why don't we just censor the daylights out of a newborn child, right? Put 6, 7, 8 different sensors. Because what is a parent going to know how the child is hungry? I'm going to look at the straight biological indications and signals. And then you say, well, what are you going to sing a lullaby? What do you know? How many lullabies do you know? 10, 15, 20? Man, I have the whole internet full of thousands and thousands of lullabies. I'm going to triangulate between all the neurochemical signals I'm getting, all the biochemical signals I'm getting, and all the data I have, and I'm going to give you just the right lullaby to help you fall asleep. There's a certain kind of worldview underneath all of that, which is actually the dominant paradigm worldview. I come from the Silicon Valley. I see this kind of stuff every single day. This is not an anomaly. So how do we look at this context and you say, what are the roots? Like, what's the problem at the roots? Not just at the tip of the iceberg. When you look at an iceberg, we used to think that, a few percentages on the top, a little bit on the bottom. Turns out 90% of an iceberg is below the surface. We don't see it. So most of the problems end up being on the top, and that's what we talk about. But what's below? And as I've started to look at this, what I've seen is that as you look below, we are disconnected. We are disconnected at a systemic level, self and the systems. The markets we're in, the climate systems that we're in, all kinds of different systems. We're disconnected socially with each other. I don't need to tell you about Facebook. Right? We're disconnected spiritually with our own selves. So we say, how do we start to reconnect? How do we start to create a polyculture that allows for that reconnection? How many of you have heard of, you're at BOKU, so let's see, I'm curious. How many of you have heard of Fukuoka? Yeah? Wow, amazing that only so many of you. How many of you have heard of permaculture, right? Everybody, I hope? Yeah? So Fukuoka was the grandfather of permaculture. Fukuoka was a Japanese farmer, incredible human being. And at some point, he has this insight, and he wants to translate it and make it practical. And so he starts farming. But on his farm, he does something very unique. He says, no tilling of the soil, no weeding. I'm never going to take out any weeds. No fertilizers, no pesticides. And so you go to his farm, right? When you go to a farm, you expect rows and rows of apples and plums and whatnot. You go to his farm, it looks like a forest. It doesn't even look like anything. You're like, what's going on here? But you have one of his produce. People would fly all over the world just to have one of his apples. Because you buy an apple from the store and you cut it in half, it's going to go black soon. You get an apple from Fukuoka's farm, it never goes black because it's already so aligned with the environment, not just the environment of that particular tree, but he says, most of the apples come from your tree. My apple comes from the whole forest. Because underneath the tree there are roots, and those roots are connected to other roots. And those other roots are connected to all the other roots, and they're all sort of self-organizing, and there's this richness. And so in one apple, you would taste his whole farm, is what he would say. And he called this do-nothing farming. Doing nothing, I was saying yesterday, right? We were in a circle. Doing nothing is much harder than actually doing something. So in ServiceSpace, we've tried to think of social permaculture. What does it mean to hold space in a way of doing nothing? Right? We do lots of different projects. You guys can check it out online. Some are like, we said there isn't enough good news in the world. Well, we should have a portal for good news. CNN's not going to do it because they want to say, oh my God, they want to scare you. And as soon as if somebody in the next room says, oh, there's a bomb threat, we would all be scared, right? Base instinct. If somebody says, oh, Nipun's giving hugs on this side, you're like, okay, well, So if you want to sell fear, it's much easier to sell. So we said no, but we also have capacities to appeal to a higher instinct. Right? So we started building these portals, and you have smile cards, which I'll tell you about towards the end. It's an act of kindness. You do an act of kindness, leave a smile card behind, tells the person who you don't know who did this, but pay it forward. You buy coffee for somebody. Right? You leave flowers for somebody who's going through a tough time. They don't know who you are, and it says you can't pay back, but you can pay forward. And like that, there's Karma Kitchen, and we have lots of different projects. But underneath it, right, the core difference is usually we go out and say, let's create impact. We start with impact, right? This is how I want to change the world. From impact, we say, well, you need project plan, right? What's your project? What are you going to do? With the project, you say, I need to have staff to implement it. And then you say, well, staff may or may not change, right? And something may happen. They may be nice guys at home or not nice guys at home, well, but hopefully after 20 years, maybe something changes. And you have this thing called inner transformation. We flipped this around. We said, we're going to start with inner transformation. We're going to give because I am changing. Thank you for the opportunity to make an offering to you. And as soon as I do that, anyone who has done that, you will know that you will have infinite community, right? You will have lots of people. And as soon as you have lots of people, let's say we're all moved by love and we're all in this circle together, you think we're just going to sit around twiddling our thumbs? We're invariably going to have projects. They will emerge. And as projects emerge, they will have impact. So it's not about not creating impact. It's about a very different process for creating impact. So what is this inner transformation? Being the change changes the being. So as you are changing, there is this inner transformation. And what is that, and what happens when you lead with that? And that's what we've been doing in ServiceSpace. And underneath it, what really happens is this, that generosity reconnects us to ourselves, to each other, and to the systems that we are embedded in. Such a simple idea. No one's going to give me or you a Nobel Prize for this. It's an ancient idea. Easily accessible, nothing to patent. And yet, it's not present, let's put it that way. So we have been trying to do this, and if you ask me, well, Nipun, this is great, fantastic, works for you, what have you learned? How can I use this in my context? So I'd leave you with these 4 things. This is a circle. I think Harman and Christine were there, so I just put this photo just for our purposes. So 4 key insights. Sorry, you're not supposed to do this while you give a talk, but number 1, keep you busy while I sip. When you work the way ServiceSpace has worked, you start with this very foundational principle, that everyone is good at something. And most of our school systems, hopefully BOKU is different, they don't work that way, right? They say, this is what I'm measuring for. Everything, even in the workplace. This is just how we've designed the world currently. And I think it's a design problem, right? It took us 5,000 years to put wheels on bags, right? A very simple idea, but why did it take us so long? Similarly, I think there's a lot of very brain-dead sorts of things that we as humanity create in terms of systems. This idea is to look at everyone and say, look, you're not going to be, if you measure by my game, you're not going to be as good at it. But why should we just measure by my game? Everyone has their own game that they're playing. Everyone is good at something. This guy, this guy too, Einstein, said if you judge, everyone's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it's going to live its whole life believing it's stupid. So obvious, and yet not so obvious if you look at our systems today. This is a friend of mine. He had a storybook life. By the age of 36, he had 5,000. He's at a tech company, 5,000 people under him in his division. And then he gets a call from the doctor, says, Feroz, you're going to be a dad. He's excited. He says, Feroz, your son is going to be autistic. It was so out of his paradigm, he goes to the bathroom and cries for half an hour straight. He didn't know how to deal with this. And he came out of his old process, and he says, I know what, this is actually the purpose of my life. So he comes in, this is his son, Vivan. He says, I'm going to try to change the world for Vivan, and my wife is going to try to support Vivan so he can fit into the world. So his mission became, how can I integrate people who are autistic into the world? Now, if someone comes and says, yeah, will you please hire my autistic son? Most people are going to say no. Feroz says, forget about other people. I have a division. I have problems to solve. I'm hiring people. What I will do is hire 5 people on the autism spectrum. And he says, well, let me look. Everyone is good at something, right? What are they good at? Well, they don't lie. They're never late, right? They don't get bored. So he said, wow, I wish all the rest of my staff was like that, right? And so he looks at these assets and he says, I have problems to solve. Now I'm going to change how I design my problem so I can incorporate their strengths in it. became a Harvard case study. The CEO of SAP, his company was SAP, CEO of SAP comes and says, by 2020, Feroz, I want the whole 1% of the entire company to be on the autism spectrum. And now so many companies have followed suit. But it started with him saying, everyone is good at something, and I want to incorporate that. Without that, you just cannot have a polyculture. Otherwise, you have extreme monoculture, which is what we're seeing in the world. And underneath it, there's this principle that we have this equation, which is not spoken, but capital equals money. Wealth equals money. Money is a form of wealth. I respect it. But there are so many other forms of wealth, right? Attention is a form of wealth. Someone was just sharing about listening, right? It's so hard to listen these days. It's community is a form of capital. Compassion, time is a form of capital. Everyone can contribute. There's a million different capitals. Right? And we learned this certainly on our pilgrimage, and we've even got Mr. Barack Obama agreeing to this. Now we got it on record, right? He says we should remember that capital is not just financial, it is social, informational, experiential, spiritual, emotional, and he lists 8 of them, but actually I would say there's infinite forms of capital. As many people, as many hearts, those many capitals, because we want to all contribute. So the second thing where I extend this is not just that everyone is good at something, but that everyone can be great at giving. Everyone. Not Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Not like, oh, I'm a millionaire, so now I can give. Everyone can be great at giving. And everyone wants to give. We are wired to give. It's so clear. We have scientific evidence that even as an 18-month-old, you are wired, you want to give, before you even learn these concepts. Martin Luther King Jr. said this very clearly. Everyone can be great because everyone can serve. This is a friend of mine who's unfortunately passed away, but he has no legs. He grew up very poor, had very little, but he said, I want to give. She says, well, what can you give? You can't even walk. But the funny thing is that because he didn't have legs, he would scoot. So he would be like, ksh, ksh, with his slippers on his hands. He would walk like that. So whenever he would walk, and he lived in this very big slum where there was all kinds of different problems. In particular, there was a lot of violence. So a lot of the men were beating up the women, and when this guy walks, shh, 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 you kind of hear him. And all the women who were in pain and suffering and didn't have anybody to go to, they didn't feel intimidated by this guy. And because they didn't feel intimidated, they shared their burdens with him. And he says, I want to give, but what can I do? I can't take you out of your suffering right now, but how can I help? So he thought of something remarkable. He decided to take these holy basil plants. They're considered very holy, especially in India. Like these plants over there. So he would go and he would say, sister, I hear you. I can't do anything about it, but I'm going to give you a plant. And let's sit together and pray. Let's sit together and share a moment of silence. Let's see if that pain gets a little lesser. And then he would go back every 2 weeks and he says, how's the plant doing? And I don't know, if any of you have grown plants, it's a kind of joyous thing, right? You see a little thing growing, it fills you. And not only that, you're doing it with your kids, you're doing it with so many people around you, and all of a sudden, it starts to have a conversation, it starts to create all kinds of different ripples. And this guy, who had no legs, who had very little money, he says, in a span of 2 years, I gave out 900 tulsi plants. 900 people were suffering in that way. Now, that is a value that you or I simply cannot do. That is a value that no nonprofit is going to be able to deliver on. That is a value that no corporate CSR budget is going to be able to do, because it requires deep trust. It's something he was uniquely positioned for. But if you have to start with this idea that everyone wants to be great at giving, everyone can be great at giving. So he's an example of that. And science, of course, backs us up. Right? So a lot of people say, oh, well, giving, I don't know, I should do that when I'm 60 or something like that. It turns out, if you look at the science, so they looked at a whole bunch of people who love to solve puzzles. And they said, I love to solve puzzles just because that's really fun for me. They said, great. Then they go in and they pay them to solve the same puzzles. They're like fantastic. Now I can go buy something at the store and still do what I love to do. Then they say, come back in the third time, and they said, oh, you know that payment we were giving you? Sorry, our funding ran dry. No more payments. So you would think you added money and now you removed money. You should be back to where you were. You should be solving problems for the love of it. Guess what happens? You don't do puzzles anymore. Money desensitizes us. So that, and this is not like one-off research. This is very conclusive research you see again and again. And you also see that little kids, like I was saying, it's like amazing stories, beautiful stories. If we had more time, I could tell you lots of stories of just people who haven't even learned generosity. You don't need to learn generosity. You need to learn greed. Right? Greed is like conditioned behavior. Generosity, in fact, we are wired to care. We actually don't need any of this. So what happens, I think, in the third phase, which I think is very interesting, is that as that giving, as you and I start giving, and that giving gets connected, you create a whole new possibility. And this is a photo from this afternoon. We held a karma kitchen right here, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce which area it was in and where it was, but it was somewhere here in Vienna, and we held a karma kitchen. Now, what happens in a karma kitchen is it's like a restaurant. This is not a photo from today, but this is in Berkeley where I live. You walk into a restaurant, like any other restaurant, and you have a meal. Now, at the end of your meal, your check, it reads 0. It's 0 because someone before you paid for you, and you get a chance to pay forward whatever you want for people after you. And most people look at that, wait a second, I thought people are all selfish. And actually, you don't have to believe that because that's the fundamental basis of economics, that we are rational beings, two fundamental bases. One, we're rational beings, and two, we aim to maximize self-interest. Everything of economics is built on that assumption. So when you do something like this, people are like, yeah, cute, very cute, you know? You let us know when your hippies are done with this, right? Like, let's talk in next year. So Harvard actually came to study us, Harvard Business School, because it became the top-rated restaurant across all of Berkeley. Right? And they were like, this is nuts. I told you you're going to scratch your head by the end. This is nuts. Right? Except that it kept going and going and going and going, now in 23 places around the world, and you realize, oh, and now there's so much more research, and UC Berkeley then ended up doing this seminal research paper, and the title of this research paper was Paying More When Paying for Others. So it doesn't mean your Lexus car dealership is going to work in this way, right? But it does mean that if you have spaces where you have strong context, this giving, as it gets engaged, it creates a gift economy, that people actually will respond to generosity with greater generosity. I do something for you, you do something for this person, and what goes around eventually comes back around in a closed-loop system of a restaurant. It is amazing. But we don't have enough examples of this. And the kinds of things that happen in this space. The reason why it's amazing is not because the finances work out. Because I'm not interested in balancing my ledgers. I mean, sure, you have to do that. But that's a minor detail. The thing is, are we creating new value in the world that you are not able to deliver in the dominant paradigm? So, for example, right, there's a whole bunch of examples. I don't know which story to give you. I'll tell you a story. I have to go till 7:40? 45. Okay, all right, then I'll tell you the story. So this guy walks into Karma Kitchen first time. One of his friends knew about it, brings him in. As he brings him in, he's like, this guy's very confused. He's like, what? Like, no one in this restaurant is like paying for themselves. They're all paying for somebody else, and they're doing it voluntarily, and it's still working in so many years. What's going on? Very confused by it. Comes, sits down. But he kind of sees, when you get into a place like that, I don't know if you've experienced it, but it's like the vibration of selflessness is so much stronger, right? Like everyone's happy, everyone's beaming. So this guy's like, yeah, I kind of want to sit here, but I don't understand it. Okay, they're at a table of 6. He's ordering the food. Waiter, who's a volunteer, looks at the waiter. He says, just like you saw, you can't see it too well, but we have these Karma Kitchen t-shirts. He looks at the waiter's shirt and he says, that's a really nice shirt. Where can I buy one of those? And the waiter says, sorry, we don't do the B word here. He says, sorry, there's no place. I don't know where to buy it. I mean, I got it because I was a volunteer, and so it's gifted to us. He says, oh, okay, and then they kind of went on, and he did his thing. This guy, who's a waiter, I was volunteering there too. He comes up to me, and he comes and he asks me, he's like, hey, Nipun, do you have an extra T-shirt? He didn't say Karma Kitchen T-shirt, just any old T-shirt. Yeah, I happen to have one. I thought maybe he spilled something, right? Like, I didn't know why he wanted it. He goes in the back, takes off his shirt, puts on the shirt I gave him, goes to this guest, and packages it up. You can see a little thing. It says, please laundry before using. But imagine this guy walking into this place. He hasn't even finished. He hasn't even gotten to the check where he pays forward. And now all of a sudden, literally, the waiter has taken the shirt off his back. How do you respond to that? He didn't know how to respond. How do you respond to great love? So he calls the waiter after a few minutes, very perplexed. He says, hey, man, can you come over? Look, I know this is not anything to do with my meal, but I'm just very moved, man, that people are all acting in this way. I work at eBay, and I get these gift cards. And so this is for you guys. And there's two $50 gift cards, $100. Good business plan, right? One T-shirt, $100. Wow. He gives $100. So this guy comes to me, and he says, Nipun, here's $100. What should I do? I said, well, what's this for? He said, it's for Karma Kitchen. I said, who's Karma Kitchen? All of us. So ask him to go give it to the random person. Why is he giving it to us? This is not connected to the meal. So he goes back and he says, sir, why don't you give it to somebody else? And this guy's like, are you kidding me? Who are you people? And then he says, look, I'm an introvert. I'm not comfortable going to a random table. I don't do this kind of stuff. And he says, okay, I'll do it. And he goes to a table. And the first table he goes to is a first-time guest where this woman has brought her little young kid with a piggy bank because she wants him to learn about generosity, paying forward for somebody who you don't see or recognize. It's an indirect reciprocity, not direct. And she wanted her to understand, and she's like, ma'am, someone's cup of gratitude was overflowing on another table, and this is for you. And she's like, her first time, and they haven't even had their food, so she's like, what is this place? Like, money falling from the skies, or what is this, heaven, or what is it? Everyone starts to behave differently in this kind of a space. And when you behave differently, you create very different patterns. Very different patterns of behavior. This guy proposed to his wife, and what he used was their first date was at Karma Kitchen. And at the end of the meal, they gave him a little keychain. And he was so touched by it that he proposes, he comes to Karma Kitchen, puts his ring on that smile keychain. Right? And they go on, we have a fantastic time. He goes on to create this life-changing spoon for people who are differently abled and gets bought over by Google. But here's the thing, is that we read this in the paper, company got bought over by Google, great impact. But if it wasn't for these volunteers, volunteering on that day to give that smile keychain to touch that one person's life, you would not have this chain of this very talented person saying, I want to use my skills in service to mankind. And we forget about that ripple effect. And we all want to be on the front end of the ripple effect, but actually if you don't have the field, if you don't have Fukuoka's farm, you cannot have the same apples. Everyone who tried to copy Fukuoka, he was very clear, you cannot copy me. You have to build your own field in your own context. And who I am is part of the context. Who you are is part of the context. What our relationship is part of the context. Who the systems we're embedded in is part of the context. And I need to listen so I can tap into that and find a skillful way to grow my apples. So giving sounds cute, but actually it can change the game. And the last step, here's a guy who actually runs it's not just a restaurant, he runs his magazine in this way. He says, he was actually running it as a paid subscription. He says, from now on, only offerings of gratitude. I'm doubling down on gratitude. This woman runs her acupuncture clinic in the same way. This guy runs his rickshaw in the same way. He says, no meter. I need the $3 I'm going to make today to feed my family, but I'm willing to risk it all because in the spirit of love, because I know that if I treat you with love, if I trust that love in you, love begets love, on that equation, I'm willing to risk everything. And it's been amazing. It's been 7 years, and everyone's talking about it. Ashima, you know him? So, in summary, before I get to the fourth point, right, if we lead with this inner transformation, being the change so that you can change your being, we start with this idea that everyone is good at something. When everyone has a gift, not poison, right? The English gift, we realize that everyone can be great at giving. They actually want to give those gifts, put them in circulation. And if everyone's generosity is engaged, a whole different gift ecology emerges. A whole different field of intelligence is present for the designs to create. And as we get there, when such a gratitude network emerges, we come to the fourth point, which is that everyone is connected to everything. And we know this intellectually. We've all said, oh, we're all interconnected. Can't you see what's happening with the weather? She was telling me in Romania, 30 degrees, right? Between one day and another day, 30-degree differential of wet. I mean, this is like, we've created a lot of problems in the world, and I think we're not even aware of it. And we say, can't you see everyone's connected to everything? But if you don't have the field underneath it, if you don't have the foundation, it's just going to be intellectual. So how do we start? And so what happens here? Intellectually, I'm from the Silicon Valley. They'll tell you all this kind of stuff, right? They'll say, and this is true, this is math. Right? In the TV model, if you had a room full of just 50 people, just a few of us here, how many connections are possible? 50. Right? This is Sarnoff's law. In the telephone network, where everyone can talk to each other, how many connections are possible? This is Metcalfe's law, 1,225. But in the online world, in the many-to-many network, in the computer era, WhatsApp era, how many connections are possible just in a room full of 50 people? Reed's law, 100 million trillion. You're like, whoa, wait a second, you could do a lot. And people have done a lot. They've done a lot for profit. We've seen a few for protest, but we haven't seen enough for love. This is another way to visualize this, right? This is a many-to-many kind of a network. Yet another way is this is a centralized network, this is a decentralized network, and this is a distributed network. But what excites me most is when you put multiple forms of capital, that we're all good at something or another. In this room, I would never have a doubt, in any room, in any place, with as many number of people that are possible, we can create a revolution, but we have to change ourselves to see multiple forms of capital. If we can actually see all the different capitals that everyone is capable of, and we combine that with the capacities of a distributed network of 100 million trillion, do you know the potential that is there right now? It is staggering. And this is what we have been trying to do in ServiceSpace, but we need a lot of service spaces. And we can all tap into that. And I think the way to tap into that is to be the change. But not just be the change with the understanding that in being the change, I'm actually changing myself. And the reason why that's different is because then you don't go in with this and say, I am going to help you, I am going to change the world, I'm going to do this. You say, thank you for the opportunity that I get to grow in generosity. This man, very celebrated change maker. He has built hundreds of thousands of toilets. In terms of impact, very few people on the planet would have the kind of impact he had. But you know the most amazing thing? When he passed away a few years ago, at his funeral, his wife goes on the mic and she says, everyone knows, the world knows what he has done. The world knows how he has changed millions of lives. But let me tell you how he has changed mine. Because here was a man who we'd been married over 40 years. He never got angry with me even once. He was not just changing things on the outside, he was actually changing himself along the way. If you're doing acts of love, how can you not, and how do you start to draw the boundary? If my wife says I'm a really mean person, but he's kind to others on the outside, there's a kind of problem with that. Like, how do you start to go down this track? And I think if we do, we realize, wow, that through that act of service, I'm actually changing myself. And it's a profound way to change ourselves and the world. And I think one very significant way, I'm ending on time. I still got 2.5 more minutes. Maybe I'll throw in one more story. Should I? before I get to the story, this is a bridge. It's called a living bridge. In very rural sort of Meghalaya part of India, they have these, they can't put cement posts there, but they have these living bridges. But do you know what these living bridges are made of? Roots. It takes 500 generations to create this bridge. Every generation knows that their responsibility is to take that little root and connect it to the next, right? Take that little root, connect it to the next. You can Google this. This is a real thing. It's still alive. It's a living bridge. It's so resilient. It's so rich. It's connecting life to life on two different banks of the river. And so this work that we're doing, we go and say, oh my God, I did this and this happened. Well, if you don't have the foundation underneath it, it's just not going to work. But if you actually hold this, you say, wow, I don't need to get credit for what I'm doing. Maybe it's for 5 generations later. I'm going to be the change in the most sincere way I know how. And that's going to create a ripple effect. And I don't need to be there to get credit for that ripple effect. I don't even need to see how it's proceeding, because I know that love will multiply, love will get passed on, that love is a far stronger force than greed. And if we act in that integrity, if we look at life in that way, we start to see multiple forms of capital. We combine them with the technologies that allow us to create many-to-many networks. I think a real revolution is possible. And that is only possible. It all starts. Here's the story. I'm going to fix it into my conclusion somehow. It all starts with all of us doing that small act, but not doing it just to change the world, but also seeing the inner ripple effect it creates. I met with a friend of mine. He's a very rich person in the world. He wanted to meet with me. And as he meets me, he's like, people who are usually successful in the business world, they have an agenda. They're like, he says, look, I know all about giving. I know that's your field, but I don't know about receiving. Can you tell me about receiving? He was focused with our dinner time, right? So I said, okay, well, let's talk about receiving. We had a wonderful time. We talked about receiving. Then it was time to pay the check. I paid the bill. And I said, one of my small little habits, I'm not a person, with a lot of financial capital, but I still I love to give, right? And he likes to give. He happens to, it's like both our bank accounts have zeros, but his just has a 1 in front of it, so. And he knew that, so I was like, let me pay, and he's like, no, let me pay, and we're fighting about it, and I said, he says, there's no way I can let you pay. I said, no, man, give me the opportunity. Okay, then we said, here's what we'll do. You know that smile card thing we talked about? I will pay for our table, but you pay for another table. He says, oh, okay, I like that idea. So he's the first thing, right? First problem. Who to pay for? I don't know what his algorithm was, but he's like, no, too happy. Somehow he figured out this couple right there. So he calls the waitress, and the waitress is like, oh, he says, well, we'd like to pay for another table. First question, why? What do you mean? Nobody does that. Okay, and then she says, which table? And then he tells them, and he says, it's got to be anonymous. Don't tell them we did this. Tell them we just wanted to make their day. And if they're moved, the smile card is a reminder that you will pay it forward. Okay, waitress goes there. Now, this is supposed to be anonymous, right? And so he is saying, I'm not going to look at the waitress, but he's a little tempted, right? So he's looking at the window on this side, and he's saying, let me look at the reflection. And I'm trying to be one step more hardcore than him. I'm like, I'm not going to look at the window, but I'm looking at him. Right? I'm looking at him, he's looking at there, and the action is happening there. And the waitress comes back. And now as she comes back, her name was Mandy. You can imagine, right? She goes up on that table, and she's just beaming when she comes back. And we said, how was it? What happened? He says, I went and I told them, and they said, what? What is this? Why? And she goes through that whole process. Her sort of neurons are firing in all kinds of directions. Those other people, they looked at me and they said, we're not from here, but do you guys do this here all the time? Because then we want to move here, And she goes from there and I looked at this guy, and you can imagine the smile on his face. It was so clear. And when we had the conversation, I said, my brother, were you giving or were you receiving? He gave financial capital, but only a fool would say he wasn't receiving anything in that moment. It was so clear that he was receiving. To him, to me, to Mandy, to even that table if they found out. So in giving, we are receiving. And ultimately, if we just understand the process and we don't even keep track of giving or receiving and just dance to the rhythm of whatever life throws in front of us with that heart of service, I think we create a different world for ourselves, for other people, and will change the systems in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.